The ER staff was in a frenzy. Tubes, injections, alarms. My survival was in their hands. My family? They treated it like dinner theater. "Do you serve coffee here?" my mother asked, waving a glossy magazine. My father negotiated with a billing clerk, louder than the heart monitor. My sister told me to smile for the story update while I could still breathe. At that moment, between gasps, I realized I was the side character in my own medical emergency, starring my family's grievances instead. And the next act? A helicopter landing that changed everything. When breathing turns into a background distraction. The moment my lips began to swell and my throat tightened like it had been cinched with invisible hands, I knew this was not going to pass with a glass of water and a cool rag. It started almost casually, an itch at the back of my mouth, a prickling sensation that seemed harmless enough. But very quickly, each breath felt like dragging air through a straw that was shrinking by the second. By the time the paramedics swung me into the ambulance, alarms were already flashing, and the medic hovering over me muttered in a sharp tone, one that made me realize this reaction wasn't only fast, it was vicious. They jammed a needle into my thigh, voices overlapping, hands pressing oxygen to my face as if brute force could drag air past the blockade in my throat. Every sound was urgent, clipped, decisive. It was chaos with purpose. The ride blurred into the clang of hospital doors, the squeak of sneakers on linoleum, the sharp sting of disinfectant searing my nose. Nurses rushed, doctors barked orders, machines armed themselves with shrill beeps. One of them shouted a string of numbers I couldn't decipher, and a respiratory tech leaned hard on a tube, trying to open a pathway before my airway sealed completely. Within seconds, a cart materialized at my side, like the hospital had rehearsed this ballet of catastrophe 1,000 times. The staff moved as one, their faces sharp with concentration, shoulders squared with grim resolve. Every inch of me was flashing red in their hands, an urgent signal they recognized instantly. My survival depended on their fast, hard rhythm. And then, only a few feet away, the off-key counterpoint of my family. They didn't just ignore the tone of alarm, they drowned it with their own noise. My father, arms crossed, jabbed a finger at the ER television. "Why is this just looping hospital propaganda? Where's the sports package I pay for every month?" His voice cut through the room louder than the warning beep of my oxygen levels falling. He wasn't whispering. He wanted everyone to know how he felt draped in this injustice. Doctors leaned over my body, threading lines into my veins. But Dad's biggest emergency was network television. My sister sat slouched in a chair that nurses had intended for family comfort, pulling at a sleeve that fell perfectly to catch the blue glow of her phone screen. She didn't so much as flinch when a paramedic pressed their whole weight on my chest to expand my lungs. Her response was to tug the phone up eye level and adjust her chin for a better angle, capturing the fluorescent lights overhead as if they were a set design chosen exclusively for her. Her brows furrowed, not from fear, but from deciding between captions that would maximize engagement. The crisis for her was whether emojis were too flippant for late-night drama. My mother, sitting squarely between the hand sanitizer dispenser and a snack vending machine, looked as if she'd been banished to a bus station. She pinched her coat tighter, sighing into the sterile air loud enough that the nearest nurse turned, thinking it was my own distress. "No tea service? Not even basic cable, and no tea service?" she muttered, as a doctor threaded a breathing mask around my mouth. I caught the disconnect through foggy vision. One team fighting for air in my lungs, another bickering about petty luxuries, each group completely unaware of the other's rhythm. The absurdity didn't stop there. As the paramedics slid a scope toward my throat, my father actually waved at one of the attending staff to attract their attention. "Excuse me," he bellowed, almost over the suction machine. "Is this going to rack up some kind of out-of-network charge? Because I didn't sign on for an experimental circus here." The doctor didn't even break concentration, though the furrow deepened in her brow. I wanted to laugh, and if my throat had been open, it might have spilled out. Laugh at the audacity of a man comparing his daughter's collapsing airway to cell plan overages. What struck me hardest was the rhythm difference. The ER team existed in overdrive, sprints inside a marathon, adrenaline carving precision into each movement. They leaned across me with practiced speed, trading syringes, angling monitors. My family slouched through the scene with a movie theater disinterest, and eyes half on the room, half on their own annoyances. To them, the pounding urgency wasn't the shrinking line on the monitor. It was missed comforts, missing channels, missing peace. My gasps blurred into white noise beneath their conversations. Whenever a nurse barked numbers, my father countered with louder commentary about unfair consumer experiences. Whenever my pulse ticked low enough to trigger a machine's alarm, my mother squeezed her purse straps tighter as though the situation was a prolonged wait at an airport gate. I became a background track like elevator music, cluttering the air but not central enough to command attention. And somewhere between the slap of latex gloves and the snap of clear plastic packaging, I realized my worst panic wasn't choking. The deeper dread settled when I saw their faces still arranged in mild complaint, untouched by urgency. It hit harder than the tightening in my chest. They weren't treating this as life or death. They were treating it as a mild delay. As technicians rushed a second round of epinephrine into my arm, I caught my reflection in the silver gleam of a metal tray. Face red, neck swelling, eyes wide with fear. A human body failing in public. Yet, just over my shoulder, my father waved down a volunteer asking if the programming on the waiting room TV could be switched. He didn't look at me, didn't even glance. To him, this was background static while his main screen buffered. At that moment, with air rationed in desperate gulps, the tension warped. No longer just the terror of anaphylaxis or the clockwork of doctors battling time, it was the brutal clarity that my family saw this as me stealing their quiet evening. My throat closed, their patience closed tighter, and the cruel math unfolded. My breath was competing with their boredom, and my odds weren't good. Family priorities, cash over CPR. I could feel the pressure building in my chest with every shallow gasp, the room vibrating with clipped medical orders and machine alarms. Yet my father's voice somehow found a way to dominate the noise, each word slicing through the tension like it was the only conversation that mattered. He had a legal pad in his hand, the kind he carries for tax season, jotting down numbers in a furious scrawl while leaning against the wall as if he were conducting an audit, rather than waiting for his daughter's lungs to collapse. $2.75 per ambulance mile, he muttered, glaring at the medic who happened to cross his line of sight. And we came 17 miles to this hospital? That's already close to $50 before we even touch a needle. Anyone going to explain why suffering can't be scheduled closer to home? His eyes weren't even on me gasping beneath oxygen tubes. They were locked on his math, like my life was trapped in the margins of his notebook. Each attempt I made to drag in oxygen rattled like loose screws inside my chest. But his tone only sharpened. Running through numbers, while the clock above me ticked in rapid silence, I could feel more than hear. My mother joined in, tilting her head from the armchair and waving a parking slip between two fingers like it was evidence in a criminal trial. Her nails tapped against the laminate arms of the seat. Do these validation machines understand coma patients? If she goes unconscious, does that qualify as an extended stay? And who exactly reimburses for overnight lots? I'm not paying to lose my SUV in a garage because she doesn't know how to avoid peanuts. The shrill beep of my heart monitor jumped as if responding to her complaint, while the nurse pushing a line into my hand flinched but didn't answer. They were used to relatives demanding updates, but not like this. Not arithmetic pitched over the sound of an oxygen mask. Not policy debates in the middle of resuscitation. I saw their mouths move like courtroom opponents, tossing phrases back and forth about co-pays, deductibles, out-of-network, and inflated procedure charges, while the actual procedure happening was the forced expansion of my airway with plastic tubing. Every syllable they threw had nothing to do with what was happening to me, everything to do with pockets, receipts, wallets. My breath came slower, narrower, my vision spotted at the edges, but still they traded balance sheets over my head as if that was the bigger emergency. My father jabbed figures again. Interest on a medical bill stacks faster than her pulse, he said, making the analogy with dry mathematical certainty while my pulse dropped audibly on the monitor beside me. The staff didn't react, at least not the way I wanted them to. They redirected all their words directly at me, ice calm, telling me to hold on, telling me to try to stay conscious while working furiously to open new IV lines. I nodded weakly, though every attempt felt like pinning my consciousness to a ledge in strong wind. Their focus was human. My family's focus was financial. My mother flipped her slip of parking paper toward her handbag, shaking her head. I knew it, she sighed. We're going to be in debt before dessert. She could have just taken Claritin like a normal person. But no, she had to go grand opera with throat swelling. Do they even validate hospital meals anymore? Or do we need to order out for budget's sake? It was delivery service to her, not survival time. The sting wasn't just the tube pressing clumsily against my throat. It was their transparency, so clear they weren't guarding me, they were guarding their bank accounts. I wanted to force air out loud enough to say, I'm still here. This is my body you're scoring like a tournament bracket. But the only sound was the wheeze dragging from my lungs, broken and shallow, almost lost beneath my mother's musings about whether parking stamps applied at night rates. Minutes blurred together, marked only by the click of my father's pen and the shrill recurrence of monitors. His financial recital continued like sermon work. $48 for 2 Tylenols if they try it. I'll reject that code the second it comes through, he announced toward no one, as though medical billing clerks were gathered in the room watching me choke. My mother nodded, her eyebrows bouncing with smug alliance, while I coughed a fragile, cutting sound that scraped my ribs raw. I was clinging to every breath like a swimmer breaking surface, listening to my parents justify how my suffocating body was nothing more than a paper chase. The argument, if it could be called that, shifted into savings accounts. Father's voice was precise like lecture tone, layering interest calculations, muttering about what compiles annually, moaning about credit scores. Mother pulled her purse tighter, listing household utilities as though my allergic collapse were a line item competing with phone service. She shaped every word like a rebuttal in some petty marriage tribunal. Their duet of currency rang louder than the actual physical body faltering in front of them. And then, like a wave tossing me down, deeper, I realized something brutal. This wasn't negligence designed to hide their fear. They weren't using money talk as disguise. They simply cared more. The transaction was heavier than breath, heavier than pulse. I was lying on a gurney, my throat shrinking to a pinhole, while my father raised his voice about what percentage credit cards tack on, and my mother demanded clarification if coma meant they could leave for cheaper. The absurdity stung less than the sting of being disposable, a ledger entry with human features. Nurses moved fluid, introducing medication, adjusting pressure bags, their murmurs spiraling between hope and urgency. None of it performed enough to impress my parents into silence. They filled air with fears of bankruptcy rather than fears of losing a daughter. The real insult wasn't their words, though the words lacerated. It was plain to see in their faces, in the casual rhythm of their complaints. To them, the looming possibility of debt was worse than the looming possibility of me not waking back up. As my lungs fought to expand around a whisper-wide airway, a terrible clarity hit me squarely in the chest. I wasn't a patient. I wasn't even their child. I was a debit card that happened to wheeze. A plastic rectangle with allergies. Every gasp I made only reminded them of interest rates racking up with each cough. Every machine beep recorded to me was logged by them as billable minutes. Suddenly, the fear of suffocating wasn't as sharp as the fear of being seen as nothing more than financial inconvenience. That truth hollowed me out deeper than lack of air ever could. The live tweet hospital vigil. I caught the flicker of light before I even saw her face. That cold, artificial glow that only comes from a phone screen, balanced perfectly in front of eyes not interested in anything else. My sister sat cross-legged in the padded recliner, angled toward the corner, where the shadows fell softer. She raised her wrist at the right height, adjusted her chin so the edges of her jaw looked sharp, then pressed record. Behind her, I lay strapped to a monitor, airway collapsing. To her, it was all just the backdrop for her latest content cycle. Day one of my hospital vigil, she whispered into the camera with the excitement of someone doing unboxing reviews. Pray for us, but not too hard. The light here is tragic. And then came the hashtags passed straight into her feed like IV fluids for her ego. Sister struggles? Hospital life, drama but make it chic. The nurses moved in tight formation at my bedside, calling out doses and checking vitals. Each sound was clipped, urgent, vital. Then from 3 feet away came the unmistakable artificial click of her taking yet another photo. Not of me, not of the tangle of wires, tubes, and blood pressure cuffs. Just her, framed at an angle that made her sweater's color pop against the sterile wall. A doctor stood at my side, pressing down on a syringe, her face tense as she measured my dropping oxygen levels. My sister, oblivious, captioned a shot with, "Hospital chic but add trauma accessories." While machines screamed warnings that my body might not endure the night, she angled her head and pouted. I heard her murmur something about brand synergy while the nurses pressed an oxygen mask tighter against my face. She scrolled through her mentions, checking engagement. Beneath her breath, she counted likes, not respirations. She leaned toward our mother, phone held flat like a mirror. "If I hit 15,000 views on this story, do you think I can call it a collab? Maybe tag a candle company? People eat up candlelight with tragic vibes." My mother didn't respond. She was still preoccupied with her coffee grievance from earlier. That silence left my sister free to carry on constructing her spotlight. While my skin blotched red and my lips purpled, she debated fonts for overlay text on a video clip titled "ER but make it relatable." There wasn't even an attempt to hide it. Any doctor, looking up, could see her mouthing into the frame. The resident at my right shifted her weight uncomfortably, glancing toward my sister with a look I didn't recognize until later. It was disbelief carved into professionalism, forced to hold steady while a family member used tragedy as a tripod. But she didn't say anything. She just pressed her hand firmer against another shot of epinephrine while my sister whispered, "Okay, guys. Update. She's still freaking struggling. Can you believe it?" The surreal part was the stream of responses pinging on her screen, faster than medical updates reached my ears. Tiny icons, hearts, comments. Digital strangers sending support. "Stay strong, Queen," one response scrolled past. Another said, "Sending prayers, love your vibe even in chaos." Every message landed quicker than my parents' eyes landed on me. My sister even let out an amused laugh at one comment comparing the beeps of my heart monitor to lo-fi background music. She turned in her chair and grinned at the phone as if she'd just won something. The hypocrisy burned hotter with each suffocated breath. It wasn't my family leaning forward, gripping the bed, or whispering encouragement in my ear. It was faceless usernames on her live stream. It was followers around the world typing through screens, acknowledging more of my existence than the people physically seated in the same fluorescent room. She giggled at one reply that suggested hashtags for surviving sibling content. My chest felt like fire, my throat a tightly screwed lid, but somehow the absurdity shot sharper. I was surrounded by strangers more invested in my seconds than she was. When the doctor leaned close to explain another intervention, my sister reached for her tripod attachment to stabilize her shot. She shushed a nurse by tapping a finger against her lip, as though saving me from suffocating was minor background noise interrupting her broadcast. The staff's patience strained but didn't break. Maybe they'd seen versions of this before, but even they couldn't anticipate how far she'd push. Within minutes, she was whispering potential sponsorship deals into her phone mic, negotiating with a skincare rep who wanted to spotlight her raw perseverance look. The nurse taping down a breathing line shook her head, muttering something under her breath that sounded almost like prayer. By then, I wasn't sure which frightened me more. The fact that my lungs demanded artificial pressure just to work, or the fact my sister saw this moment less as a crisis and more as a branding opportunity. She wasn't a part of a family vigil. She had transformed the ER into a studio, the walls her set, the beeping machines her soundtrack. Every photograph was another installment, every hashtag another revenue strategy. She looked at my illness the way a filmmaker looks at lighting. What can be captured? What can be packaged? What can be monetized? At one point she even leaned low, nearly covering the amber glow from a monitor, and whispered toward me, "Just open your eyes for like 2 seconds. It'll kill online to show you awake." I couldn't respond, could barely open them as heavy black fog curled around my sight. But in that narrow sliver of vision, I caught her smile widen when she noticed another flood of notifications signaling attention. She didn't need me alert. She just needed me alive enough to keep the storyline trending. Her feed grew in real time, climbing with every shaky video of her sipping coffee and sighing at hospital vending machines, every image of her knuckles pressed dramatically against her cheek as she framed herself, holding strong. I could feel the irony pressing almost as hard as the oxygen mask on my face. I was fighting for air, and she was fighting for approval ticks from people thousands of miles away. The cruelest reveal came between gasps. I realized if she scrolled just an inch lower, she'd see more strangers pleading for my recovery than my parents had spoken, encouraging words all night. People online who had never met me showed more concern in text lines than my own family had shown with their human eyes. And that truth lodged deeper in my aching chest than any swelling. For the first time, the thought clawed in. I might not be remembered as Celeste Ravenrest, sister, daughter, patient. I might instead end up as content, a footnote in someone else's curated feed. And somehow, that felt like the cruelest suffocation of all. Mom treats the ER like a hotel lobby. My mother had a way of making any room feel like a poorly managed bed and breakfast. And the emergency department was no different. While the doctors rearranged carts of medication at my side, she sat forward in her chair, ankles crossed, smoothing the creases on her blazer as if about to deliver a Yelp review none of them had asked for. Her voice carried over the mechanical alarms without hesitation, flat but loud, designed to be overheard. I will say, she began, drawing out the syllables, the lighting here is harsh, worse than a motel off the freeway. They should consider warmer bulbs, something welcoming. Healing should have ambiance. A nurse bent over my wrist, tightening a blood pressure cuff, her eyes flickering upward for just a second before returning to the task. The cuff squeezed, my pulse hammered, and my mother noted aloud, even the pillows feel cheap, scratchy, not suitable for resting long term. By then, I could barely manage a shallow inhale, air catching at the back of my throat. The physician leaned over my chest, explaining calmly what was happening. Epinephrine. Quick intervention. Breathing tube ready if reaction worsened. She spread the information crisp and clear, trying to guide my family into understanding. My mother tapped her finger on the arm of the chair, as though timing a performance piece, and when the doctor paused, she lifted her hand abruptly. Before all that, Mother said, gesturing toward the hallway, is there anyone competent I can request for turndown? Sheets feel industrial. And if my daughter's here indefinitely, we should at least expect hospital standards equal to a mid-range chain. My mind reeled, lungs burning, while the nurse froze mid-motion with an IV line dangling inches from my arm. The doctor pursed her mouth shut, turning back to the scope. When the fluids began to run, my mother made a soft clucking sound. Unlabeled bags, delivered without ceremony, inattentive of presentation. If they hope for a 5-star review, they've already lost their chance. She reached into her purse, pulled out a fountain pen she carried only for situations where criticism seemed most necessary, and began writing in her notebook. Her eyes darted around the room, cataloging what she scorned. Loose wires, stains on the linoleum, shoes squeaking ungracefully. She didn't study me. She studied the space with the furious detachment of a food inspector, certain she would close the restaurant before dessert. At one point, my chest rose unevenly and a terrifying rasp escaped my throat. Nurses leaned close, adjusting the mask over my mouth, one calling out oxygen levels as the machine shrieked. My mother, unbothered, lifted her arm to wave determinedly at a nurse on the far end of the ward. "Excuse me, be a dear," she called across the chaos. "Can you arrange a decaf latte? Not regular. Decaf, with oat milk, if that's an option. Something soothing after all this." The nurse didn't break stride, rushing past with a tray of syringes. My mother clicked her tongue, unimpressed. "Unhelpful," she murmured. "Guests shouldn't have to beg for amenities." The physician gathered my parents closer, or at least made the attempt. She slowed her tone, emphasized the seriousness of injecting more epinephrine, explained again that my throat was closing faster than expected. Only fragments reached my ears, drowned by the pounding of blood and humming of monitors. My mother's response was not a question about risks or outcomes, but a complaint delivered with the casual finality of a businesswoman reviewing banquet halls. This blanket feels like sandpaper. Thin. Prickly, she said, tugging the woven edge between her fingers. Surely, a hospital of this size can invest in proper throws. My daughter needs comfort, not military-issue scraps. My mouth opened, but only airless noise came out. Nurses pushed harder, repositioning masks, adjusting levels, their concentration unbroken, even as my mother continued. Wi-Fi became her next grievance. She lifted her phone, shook it, scowled at the single bar of service displayed. It drops every time I refresh, she announced to no one specifically. I can't update family chat threads like this. What sort of operation doesn't prioritize connectivity? Does tragedy mean nothing unless live-streamed properly? My sister half laughed from the corner, clearly amused by her inadvertent tie-in to her own feed, while my mother sighed with the kind of patience reserved for incompetent caterers at weddings. Her neck craned toward the ceiling tiles, lips pursed, waiting for someone to validate her frustration. No one did. Meanwhile, the physician's voice sharpened. Her airway is constricting. We may need to intubate. The words fell across the bed heavy as lead. A sudden shiver tore through my chest at the sound, but my mother did not flinch. She adjusted her blazer, glanced at the clock, and exhaled through her nose with calculated disdain. Leaning into her chair, she turned her voice loud enough that the television in the waiting room, muffled behind a door, could not drown it. If she must, she sighed. Tell her to be quiet about it. People are trying to watch Dr. Phil reruns. The staff looked up, even briefly, in disbelief. My sister smirked at her phone, as if the moment had been scripted for her story feed. My father kept fiddling with receipts. And me? I lay there with a throat tightening to a thin straw, realizing my mother had turned my struggle into nothing more than an inconvenience at a poorly run lodge. My cries sounded to her like disturbances in the hotel corridor while she tried to nap. My danger ranked below television programming, and in that instant between rasps and monitors, the truth pressed heavier onto my chest than the allergic reaction ever could. My survival was a side note compared to her review. No matter how many machines hummed louder or how many doctors pressed faster, my mother still saw this place less as a lifeline and more as a lodging with bad housekeeping. The pain wasn't just that my throat was closing. It was that her eyes weighed customer service heavier than her daughter's collapse. Her sigh carried more volume than the reality I was dying. And as the nurse slid another injection into my skin, I caught the faintest thought before vision blurred again. I could flatline right here, and my mother's only feedback would be that room service never asked if she preferred firm or soft pillows. The first flatline and zero family panic. The room had been building toward it for hours, all the small alarms and clipped warnings stacking up around me. But when it finally happened, when the monitor at my head let out that long, flat tone, it was like the world folded in half. Every person in scrubs snapped into motion. The physician at my side shouted for a crash cart. Nurses moved like lightning, and the air shifted into that frantic, heavy kind of silence where every sound is clipped to the bone. My body, weak and twitching against the rails of the bed, seemed to drop out from under me. I wasn't even fully conscious, but I felt it. Something gave way, and as the lines of my heartbeat fell into a flat plateau on the screen, the panic spread through the medical staff like a current. Hands pressed into my chest, oxygen bags squeezed tighter, someone counting beats in harsh, steady numbers. But then there was my family. Seated not more than 5 feet away, they didn't even look startled. My father cut his eyes toward the monitor, frowned, then shook his head with irritation. "They seriously can't put a mute button on that thing?" he said, louder than the long tone signaling my heart had stopped. Instead of standing, instead of asking what was going on, he rubbed his forehead as though the worst part of this entire crisis was the sound design of life-saving equipment. He glanced at the remote on the chair beside him, clicked the TV, found nothing, and muttered again, "Everything in this place is noise." The irony rang so sharp I almost wanted to laugh. If I'd had the air left in me, maybe I would have. The sound announcing my flatline that should have made his stomach drop was, to him, a nuisance, a shriek on par with an old smoke detector battery beeping every 30 seconds. My own chest rattled under compressions, ribs aching with each push, but I could still hear him sighing like someone stuck in traffic. My sister chose that exact moment to adjust her tripod. Phone balanced, light angled against her cheekbones, face tilted toward the bed only enough to imply sympathy. "Quick question," she whispered, but not to the doctors. To me. Or maybe not even to me. More to her following, who would hear the update later. "If I post a heart monitor crash cut to a black screen, do you think people would call it dark humor? Or would it go viral? Because the audio from this alarm, it's kind of dramatic, perfect for transitions." She looked between me and her screen, calculating how one sister's heart failure might translate into digital engagement. Nobody answered her. The nurses were too busy anchoring paddles to my chest, shouting clear, sending volts through my body that made my limbs jolt violently. Nobody had time to engage her musings. But my sister didn't need a response. She smirked faintly, adjusted her angle, and recorded the reflection of the monitor in the glass partition. To her, this was content with atmosphere, an aesthetic, an opportunity rather than an emergency. The contradiction between their faces and the medical chaos only widened. People in scrubs darted around the bed with sweat beginning to bead at their temples. The air grew wet with disinfectant and heat from the machines. My lips, I knew, were going blue, but my mother lifted her bag into her lap, pulled out a small mirror, and reapplied her lipstick. She angled her body toward the reflection of fluorescent light to judge if the shade looked dull under the hospital bulbs. To anyone else in the room, the flat tone on the monitor was a line crossed. To her, it was background noise. I could sense how much energy it cost the staff not to scream at them. The doctor, driving compression into my chest, gritted her jaw, sweat dripping down from her hairline, and barked at the nurse to load another syringe. The defibrillator whined high, discharged, jolted me off the bed in a violent arc. Still my father groaned. "Seriously, she's been at this for hours," he complained across the room. "How long does it have to keep going? If something's going to happen, just let it. Everyone else wants some peace." That was it. That was his connection to me in that moment. Not desperate pleading for my heart to beat again, just a wish that the process would reach conclusion so he wouldn't have to hear alarms anymore. My ribs stung with every pump, electricity burned under my skin, but my father sat like a bored moviegoer waiting for credits to roll. My sister, meanwhile, typed furiously into her phone, narrating the experience with finger scrolling so fast the glow blurred. I caught fragments, hashtags like ER drama, trying to frame the Flatline into a narrative arc for social. She even stopped briefly, raising her voice only once. "Wait, if she wakes up, can I reuse the footage? Like, do-over transitions work better if the subject actually survives." One of the younger nurses swore under her breath, fumbling a vial into the physician's hand without looking at my sister. To me, the pain of my body shutting down began to dull. Colors lagged, sounds distanced. But even in that fading, I could sense it. Two spheres colliding inside one room. One was sheer human urgency, pounding fists on a chest, syringes pressed, reality that seconds could mean everything. The other was my family, unbothered, their rhythm slow, inconvenienced, treating the emergency like they'd been forced to sit through an overlong public meeting. I don't remember how long the Flatline stretched before something caught again. There was more shouting, harder pumps, then a jagged spike on the monitor screen that made staff exhale with shaky relief. Air filled my chest in ragged patches, and the shriek of the alarm stopped. The quiet lasted only a beat before my father let out a sharp comment. Finally, somebody figured it out. Relief hit the staff like water after drought, but not them, not the people who shared my blood. They did not stand, did not touch my arm, did not cry. They sat as if a bus had arrived a few minutes late and nothing more. Machines had panicked, doctors had panicked. I had disappeared into blackness and been hauled back. But my relatives sat in their corner, stiff and annoyed like the emergency was bad traffic outside. And that was the bitterest truth of the night. The great divide wasn't between life and death. It was between people who fought for my heartbeat and people who treated it like static on the radio that they wished someone would turn down. The dinner break during death. The sound that pulled me back from the edge wasn't the steady rhythm of the heart monitor or the clipped instructions from the doctors. It was the hollow crinkle of fast food wrappers. My father had started rummaging through his briefcase, as if he might have stashed a snack for emergencies. When he came up empty, he looked toward my mother with a scowl. "It's been hours," he said in that same flat voice he used when complaining about airline schedules. "We're wasting away in here." Never mind that my chest had only just been jolted back into rhythm. Never mind that the doctor was still leaning over me as if waiting for the next collapse. My parents were hungry, and hunger in their minds outranked the spectacle of my body struggling to survive. My sister perked up from her chair, eyes leaving her phone for the first time in hours, not to check on me, but to seize the opportunity of conversation. "I could destroy a plate of noodles right now," she said brightly, sliding her phone into her lap but keeping her camera app open. "Do we feel Thai or Italian?" Her words floated through the room with the same calm cadence people use while flipping through menus. The nurse beside me blinked, pausing mid-step as if she had misheard, before realizing, no, this was genuinely the conversation unfolding while my blood pressure plummeted. I tilted my eyes toward the end of the bed, mask pressing against my face, forcing air in short, controlled bursts. My body ached, as if someone had stacked cinder blocks on my ribs. I could barely nod, couldn't speak, but I could watch. And what I watched didn't look like concern. It looked like a family debating lunch options at a mall food court. My mother pulled out her phone, opened a search bar with practice speed, and began scrolling reviews. "There's a trattoria 3 streets down," she announced. "Authentic brick oven. 4 stars, but driving could be trouble with this parking garage. Maybe that Thai place closer to the freeway. Pad CU is usually reliable." Her voice was firm, pressing the words like decisions on a board meeting agenda. The heart monitor ticked out its warnings at a faster pace, spiking with every change in my ragged breathing. One of the doctors called for another line, voice urgent. My family didn't even break stride. "Italian is heavy," my father argued, tugging at the strap of his watch. "You'll just fall asleep after. Thai's lighter, fresher. Let's not complicate things." He shot one glance at the monitor as it bleeped over my fading oxygen levels, then back to his wife. "Besides, spaghetti feels tacky in emergencies." He chuckled softly as if he had made a clever point. None of the medical staff laughed. The nurse nearest my side looked from the monitor to them, eyes wide with disbelief so strong she couldn't even mask it. But my parents were impervious, moving fluidly toward consensus. My sister piped up again, tapping on her phone. "Wherever we go, can we order extra spring rolls? They'll photograph well." I'll say, "Dining while surviving family trauma." That caption writes itself. Another nurse dropped a clamp into a tray louder than intended, clearly unable to keep her annoyance contained. My sister misread it as approval for her joke. She grinned to herself, already typing. I wanted to cry out, to claw at their sleeves, to remind them I was right there, that dinner should wait until their daughter wasn't choking on air she couldn't grip. But the mask silenced me, droning in rhythmic compressions, my throat still swollen shut. The doctor's hand pressed gently against my forehead to steady me during insertion of another line, her eyes soft with encouragement, though she said nothing. She didn't need to. The weight of her sympathy carried in her silence, in sharp contrast to the chatter echoing near the door. The decision reached a crescendo as my mother rose, smoothing her blazer as though she were heading to a theater performance that couldn't wait another minute. "All right, we'll go Thai, quick and simple." "We'll toast to you pulling through," she said breezily, aiming the comment at me with a smile so vacuous it landed heavier than any scolding could have. Her hand lightly touched the metal frame of my bed, not as reassurance, but as punctuation to her statement. Nurses froze mid-motion, exchanging glances filled with disbelief. One whispered, "Unreal," under her breath, shaking her head. My sister tucked her phone into her pocketbook, finally standing, her movements lithe and casual. "Don't let her code again while we're gone," she told the room, as though giving instructions to babysitters. "I'll need continuity for the feed." My chest lurched at her words, pain spiking through my ribs as I struggled to draw breath against the mask. Of course, continuity was what mattered, not whether I lived, but whether the footage stayed tidy. They gathered near the door, casually debating side streets and traffic patterns. My father held the door for them with an absent professionalism, already muttering about how he'd gauge tipping percentages depending on service. Through the frame, I caught the last of their voices drifting back. Maybe mango sticky rice for dessert, it keeps overnight. My mother laughed softly, as though dessert talk just after a near-death flatline was tasteful. And then they were gone. The heavy door groaned, latched, and silence thicker than antiseptic filled the room. For a moment, only the mechanical hiss of my ventilator and the sleet of alarms filled my ears. The nurses stared at one another, faces twisted between pity and outrage. One shook her head with her whole body, as though shaking off the poison that lingered when a family performed such heartlessness in plain daylight. "Unbelievable," another muttered finally, pulling a blanket higher over me with deliberate gentleness. And that action, that small kindness, felt louder than anything my family had done all night. In that sterile stillness, I understood something I hadn't fully faced before. This wasn't just about their selfishness, their obsession with bills or meals or imagery for strangers online. This was about priority. To them, I wasn't an anchor worth holding onto even when air abandoned my lungs. I was an inconvenience, an interruption between courses. I wasn't their daughter bleeding into medical crises. I was a detour, a pit stop on the way to sesame chicken and jasmine rice. As the ventilator forced another procession of shallow breaths into me, the truth hardened, bitter and sharp. My parents valued dinner plans more than my pulse. My sister valued captions more than my consciousness. And the nurses who didn't even know my name until a chart told them, still valued my survival more than the trio who had raised me. I wasn't just losing oxygen. I was losing the illusion that family would anchor themselves to my survival. And as the sound of footsteps faded completely down the hall, that realization weighed heavier than any ventilator could. Helicopter entrance, the billionaire husband show. It started with a vibration in the walls. A faint hum at first, so low it blended with the constant beeping of my monitors. I thought maybe it was part of the machines, some new alarm I hadn't heard yet, one more signal that my body was slipping further out of reach. But then it grew heavier, deeper, as if the ceiling itself had started to rattle. Nurses looked up. One of the younger techs frowned, eyes cutting toward the window. It wasn't medical equipment. It was something outside, something big enough to shake the glass panes with rhythmic pulses of air. The sound swelled, harder, faster, rotor blades chopping the sky above the parking lot. Even through my drifting haze, I could recognize the sound. A helicopter. The fluorescent bulbs above my head trembled in their casings as if the building itself were startled awake. The blinds against the windows stuttered from the draft of air forced downward by spinning blades. The staff exchanged quick glances, startled but trying not to lose focus on the patient who still lay gasping. Me. My chest ached against the mask, and for a moment I wondered if the noise was just another symptom of fading consciousness. But then the windows quivered again with another churning thud of the helicopter's descent, and I knew it was real. The whirring roar grew until it consumed everything else. Even the tone of the monitors, even the frantic movements around my bed seemed muted beside that thunder. Somewhere down the hall, a voice shouted through the echo of blades, something about an unauthorized landing, but no one moved to find out who was responsible. They couldn't. They were still fixed on my body, holding me here on the fragile edge between breath and silence. Then came the footsteps. Sharp, certain, heavy against tile, purposeful in their rhythm. No hesitation, no stuttering to ask for permission. My husband entered the building as though the corridors were his corridors, the lobby his lobby, and the hospital just another acquisition on his list. The automatic doors at the far end pushed open, and moments later he appeared at the threshold of the ER bay. For a surreal heartbeat, the entire room froze. Staff caught mid-step, monitors still flashing light across my body, and me, stunned despite the fog in my vision. He was dressed like it was the opening of a gala. A tailored suit in charcoal that caught the overhead glare, pressed sharp enough to slice. Tie knotted with perfect precision. Polished shoes from a runway brand that had no business clicking across hospital linoleum. One hand still buttoned his jacket, the other swinging with clenched tension. It wasn't a costume, it was armor. He looked like someone pulled between Batman and a groom on his wedding day, torn between fury and devotion. For the first time in hours, I felt an instinct stronger than despair. My chest still resisted air, but my heart leapt painfully against the tubes and tape. He hadn't just called. He hadn't just texted. He had crossed a skyline to get here. And in the space between two mechanical breaths, a realization landed like a spark. Someone, at least one person, valued me above convenience, above receipts, above cafeteria menus. The staff, worn from hours of indifference radiating from my own blood relatives, actually blinked in surprise. One nurse whispered something under her breath, either disbelief or relief. No one could tell. They weren't used to seeing a helicopter deliver a husband to triage. They were used to families hovering, panicking, not abandoning, not detached. His arrival broke the pattern so violently, the air itself seemed disrupted. And then my family returned. They came wandering back through the automatic doors, carrying white takeout bags that clinked faintly with plastic containers, soy sauce packets visible through translucent sides. My father stopped mid-step when the sight of my husband filled his view, his brows clenched as though an unexpected expense had just landed on his credit card. My mother clutched her purse, startled less by the helicopter noise still reverberating above us than by his very presence. My sister tugged her phone out immediately, face bright. "Oh my God," she squealed low, already recording him. "What an entrance! Helicopter? That's the kind of content you don't plan, it just arrives." They looked baffled, annoyed even, that he had chosen this moment, my near suffocation, to skip out on whatever boardroom luncheon or power breakfast had been prearranged for his empire. It didn't process for them that he would trade contracts for breath, strategy sessions for IV lines. My father muttered, "He left a corporate lunch for this?" The word "this" dragged like it was beneath contempt. To him, my choking lungs warranted less priority than salad courses and shareholder chatter. But for my husband, it wasn't even a calculation. His eyes didn't drift to the nurses, didn't scan the machines. His knees nearly buckled when they reached me, his head dipping in that helpless relief of finally being near. He pressed his hand to mine, ignoring the tubes, the lines, and the sterile warnings not to interfere. Compared to the hours I had spent staring at relatives occupied by their phones, their bills, their boredom, his presence rattled me with the sharp contrast of actual devotion. He wasn't here to count interest rates, review parking validation, or draft click-worthy captions. He was here to make sure I still lived long enough to hear his voice. Even in that haze, semi-conscious, I caught every detail. The way his mouth tightened like it might crack if he let emotion leak out. The way his hand squeezed mine with both desperation and control, as if he believed tension alone could anchor me. His whole presence was a promise, not spoken but carved into the room, that if no one else fought for me, he would. The family's bafflement reached a crescendo. My father, still holding his bag of pad, thigh, scoffed. "What a ridiculous show. All these theatrics. This is a hospital, not an action movie." My mother echoed him with a shake of her head. "It's indulgent. Who even lands a helicopter here? Can you imagine the bill for that fuel?" My sister, however, hovered her phone at just the right angle, catching the scene in shaky video, already captioning it with enthusiasm. For me, none of their complaints mattered in that moment. The helicopter, the designer suit, the disbelief from staff. None of it overshadowed a simpler truth. For the first time all night, as my throat fought against swelling and my chest dragged at the ventilator, I felt valued. Not treated as a billable inconvenience or a backdrop for selfies, but as someone whose breath meant more than orientation sheets or menu options. That reality was stronger than the epinephrine coursing through my veins. My husband's presence, loud as rotor blades and sharp as pressed lapels, cut the fog that had wrapped around me for hours. And even through the noise of machines and family complaints, I let myself cling to one electric fact. I mattered to someone. Not as a burden, not as a debit card, not as content, but as a person worth flying for. Confrontation, billionaire versus bargain hunters. My husband did not ask permission to speak. He did not lower his voice to match the constant alarm of machines or wait for anyone to quiet down. He stood with his hand still on mine, his shoulders squared, and when he opened his mouth, all the routine chatter of the room died in its tracks. "You let her heart stop like it was a cutscene," he said, his jaw tight, voice muffled but sharp through the hum of the ventilator still pushing into me. His glare moved from my father to my mother to my sister, as if each word were a question pinned directly to their skin. "Do you even understand what happened while you were gone?" She flatlined. They fought for her back, and she was alone. "Was cardiac arrest just intermission to you?" The words cracked across the room louder than the helicopter blades still swinging above the roof. The weight of his tone left no polite exit, no excuse easy enough to shrug under the fluorescent lights. My father shifted his takeout bag, the plastic warming his palm with soup containers, but he did not look ashamed. His brows pressed together, his mouth drew into the same crease I knew from years of boardroom scolding, and he crafted his reply with numbers as always. "We paced. We waited. We were drained," he announced, as though each syllable were justification carved in stone. "You can't expect us to stand in here all day without food. Refueling was logical." He adjusted his glasses, tapping one finger against the temple, as though his argument were calculated with precision. "If anything, we were preserving our strength for her. Hungry people do not make rational decisions." He never once looked at me when he said it. My mother followed his lead with her voice level and even flatter, her tone carrying that air of patient superiority she used when complaining to hotel managers. "We had no choice but to eat. You don't understand what it's like keeping vigil for hours," she told my husband, though her eyes flicked toward me only briefly, like my still body was nothing more than punctuation for an argument. "If she goes on like this all night, we'll need more stamina. And anyway, no one told us she was in immediate danger. We thought they were handling it." She sat straighter in her chair, smoothing the hem of her sleeve, as though this were not her daughter laid out in the bed, but a guest whose suffering had interrupted her schedule. My sister was less restrained. She waved her phone with irritation, knowing his presence, that sudden entrance with blades and floodlights, had taken the spotlight away from her. "Honestly," she said, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling, "if someone had told me she was coding while I was filming, I wouldn't have missed it. That would have been the viral moment." She swiped at her screen furiously, face twisted with frustration as she imagined the traction she might have lost. Instead, nothing. Dead air, literally. Do you know how rare it is to capture something like that in real time? My content schedule is destroyed. She did not even flinch when the nurse nearest my bed turned sharply toward her, face frozen in disbelief. My husband clenched his jaw and stepped forward, standing between me and them with his back a kind of shield. His face, always disciplined in boardroom photographs, cracked with fury, unmasked even under harsh hospital light. "Do you hear yourselves?" he asked, his voice thick, but precise. "She nearly lost everything, her life, her breath, and you walked out because noodles were more urgent than a pulse. You treat this room like a waiting lounge when it is a war." He shook his head, rubbing a hand roughly down his face as though trying to erase the absurdity of what he had walked into. "Money, food, likes online. If you think any of it carries weight compared to one heartbeat, you are wrong. She is not a bill. She is not a distraction. She is my life." He dropped those last words like stone. The difference between them was carved sharp at that moment. He had not flinched in the face of flights, meetings, corporate empires. Yet one signal on a monitor had dragged him across a skyline. My parents, by contrast, had walked across the street in search of pad thai, carrying plastic utensils while doctors worked chest compressions. My sister crouched behind a phone screen, mourning more the absence of footage than the possibility of me gone. The staff in the room did not speak, but their silence grew swollen with judgment. Nurses adjusted lines more deliberately, their eyes flickering with quiet disapproval toward the corner where my family perched. My father started muttering something about priorities in balance and reasonable human limits, as though his calculations could shrink the gravity of leaving a flatlining daughter unattended. He tapped one finger against his notepad, rattling off figures about lost time and unpaid bills sitting on his desk at home. My mother nodded, her head tilting with resolve, pointing out again how many hours she had been in the uncomfortable hospital chair, her back sore, her patience drained, her evening ruined. My sister scrolled, thumbs jittering, still muttering about algorithms failing her at the worst possible point. My husband did not respond immediately. He held my hand harder, as though the strength of his grip could block their words from reaching me at all. His face softened only when his eyes met mine, red around the edges, holding something so raw it ached more than any tube in my throat. Then he said without raising his voice, "There is no cost I wouldn't pay. No meal I wouldn't skip. No camera I wouldn't smash. Nothing is heavier than her life, and you treat it like leftovers." A silence spread across the room, not peaceful, but brittle. The family I had grown up with sat there like cornered children who refused to admit guilt. Their bodies stiffened, their lips pressed into lines, but not one apology appeared. My husband's words cut that silence, final and precise. Some of us know what matters. Some of us never will. His devotion settled into the room like gravity itself, pulling everything into focus. The contrast sharpened so badly it hurt. He was willing to trade the weight of an empire for me. They, without hesitation, would have traded my pulse for chicken tikka masala. The social media meltdown backfires. My sister was never one to miss an opportunity, and now that my husband's helicopter had stolen the spotlight, she was clawing it back in the only way she understood. She didn't even wait for my monitors to stabilize or the staff to finish their frantic checks after my near collapse. She stood in the corner of the ER with her phone lifted high, muttering to herself as if she were pitching a television pilot. "This isn't just an update," she said into the glowing camera lens, her lips painted into a dramatic pout. "This is season 2. Season 1 was the ambulance ride, sure, but this is the high drama, the cliffhanger everyone's been waiting for. The billionaire husband swooping down in a literal helicopter while my sister flirts with death. You can't write this stuff." The nurses at my bedside exchanged glances that could curdle milk, but she was too consumed by her own narration to notice. She paced with purpose now, her hair flicking across her shoulders as she framed her own angles against the sterile backdrop of the ER. "We're trending," she whispered, swiping her screen with a fevered smile. "This is content gold. I can feel it. Hashtag tragedy to triumph. Hashtag billionaire romance. Hashtag pray for engagement." She crouched lower, trying to get my pale face into the corner of her shot. My tubes and mask turned into props for her narrative. My body was reduced to set dressing for the spectacle she believed the internet had been craving. But my husband was no bystander to her theatrics. The moment he caught her framing me through that lens like a marketing campaign, his voice cut the room open. "Take it down." He didn't shout, but the power in his tone silenced everything but the hum of the machines. My sister blinked at him, then tilted her head as though he had spoken an alien language. She laughed nervously, flipping the phone toward herself again. "Relax. I'm building empathy. People need to feel connected to her story. It's awareness work. It helps." She gestured toward her glowing screen as if it were indisputable evidence of her virtue. He stepped closer, looming over her like shadow itself, eyes fixed on the phone she clutched like armor. "This isn't awareness," he said as he narrowed his gaze. "This is you feeding on her suffering for clicks. You turned her pulse into programming. You've made her pain a hashtag." Her smile faltered for the first time that night, but only briefly. She rolled her eyes with a scoff, turning back to her audience. "Ignore him," she whispered into the mic. "He's controlling. Doesn't get how the algorithm works. Doesn't get that people care because I tell them to care." The nurses froze again, knowing a collision was coming. My husband leaned forward slightly. His voice dropped so low even I strained to hear it, over the hiss of oxygen still forcing air through me. "If you post one more clip, I'll erase it all. Every file, every follower. I will file lawsuits until your accounts are rubble. And if that's not enough, I will buy the platforms you infest, down to their data centers, just so I can shut you off." His grip tightened on my hand as he delivered the words, like he needed to anchor himself as much as me. My sister's mouth fell open, her eyes darted from him to her screen and back again. "You wouldn't," she whispered, the smile stripped clean off her face. "You can't just—" She stopped, not finishing the sentence because she realized it wasn't a bluff. For the first time she looked small in the glow of her own device, as if the dim blue light of her phone's reflection had betrayed her. Her jaw trembled with realized panic. Not because I lay half-conscious, tubes strapped to my body, tethered to machines in a tug-of-war with death. No, her panic was for her followers, for the fragile empire of likes and shares she had built, repurposing other people's pain. I almost laughed then, and it came out jagged, broken against the mask strapped to my face. My chest heaved as the laugh turned into a cough, air scratching painfully against my inflamed throat. Still, the absurdity of it made my stomach ache harder than any shock from a defibrillator. I had flatlined, actually crossed the line toward whatever lay beyond, and not once had my family reacted with genuine fear, but threatened to separate my sister from her curated audience, and suddenly a depth of horror bloomed on her face as though the world itself had ended. The room split into two separate kinds of tension. On one side, the staff hovered, still darting glances at my vitals and readying supplies in case my body dropped out again. On the other, my sister clutched her device with the kind of desperation a drowning woman clutches driftwood. Her lips moved, stuttering silent numbers, probably tallying in her head how many followers she could lose in a lawsuit or shut down. My husband kept his eyes steady, not raising his voice, not cracking his stance. He didn't need to. His silence itself was a threat lined with credibility she couldn't dismiss. I caught sight of her screen in that moment. Notifications, flood after flood, stacking in real time. They weren't cheers, though. They weren't support. They were turning. I glimpsed comments flashing, "Is this even appropriate? Why are you smiling through your sister's suffering? This feels exploitative, gross." Her audience, the invisible army she thought adored her without question, was abandoning her right before my eyes, and the horror in her expression swelled larger with each ping. My vision blurred, half from exhaustion, half from the shaking laugh caught in my chest, but I still smiled beneath the plastic of the breathing mask. Because I'd been afraid of flatlines, afraid of what it would mean to fade while no one close really noticed. But now, seeing the terror in her face, realizing how much more the idea of losing followers broke her than the image of me nearly gone, suddenly that fear felt ridiculous. If my own sister could sob over numbers on a screen faster than over my body in crisis, then perhaps death itself wasn't the scariest thing in the room. Perhaps the scariest thing was how shallow clout had made her. The nurses tried not to react. One tightened my IV with careful hands, another checked the monitor, their expressions neutral, but with a weight that said it all. They saw what I saw, the parody of it, the sick funhouse mirror of modern priorities. A woman consumed not with whether her sister lived, but with whether a Season 2 social arc was salvageable. And opposite her, a man ready to burn billions just to make sure his wife drew another breath. In that moment, my sister dropped her phone to her lap, eyes wide, scanning her dwindling metrics, and whispered almost to herself, "They're leaving me." She wasn't talking about me. She meant them, her followers, her real heartbeat. That was the punchline the universe had been building to all night. My near death wasn't her crisis. Losing her influence was. And finally, gasping into plastic tubes, but alive enough to chuckle at the irony, I realized the flatline hadn't been the darkest sound in the room. The darkest was the silence that followed when her digital tribe abandoned her one notification at a time. Family evicted from the drama they created. The order came down faster than my family could process it. My husband had spoken to his attorney before the rotor blades even cooled outside. With one curt phone call and a signature flying through email, the paperwork shifted. The authority over my care no longer rested in the hands of the people who had walked out in search of Takeout. The authority was his now, bound in legalese thicker than any hospital chart. He handed over the printouts to the attending physician with a detachment that was all boardroom, no compromise. Within minutes, security appeared at the edges of the ER bay. They didn't bark orders. They didn't have to. Just the sight of uniforms at the door was enough to change the tone. My parents were no longer entitled to linger. My sister was no longer invited to stream. At first, they didn't understand. My father frowned, hair bristling at the idea of being interrupted mid-calculation. He puffed out his chest, waving his hand as though free time gave him ownership over the space. "This is a misunderstanding," he said quickly, pressing a rhythm of logic into his words. "We're her guardians. We've been here since the beginning." His hand patted his briefcase as if documents proving ownership of a person might be inside. Then, in a strange moment of irony, He pulled from the case 2 small slips of paper. The receipts for parking validation. He thrust them toward security as though they qualified as proof of devotion. "See?" he said in a clipped tone. "We paid for the garage. We stayed." His logic collapsed under its own weight, but he forced the slips forward like shields anyway. My mother echoed him, her voice sharp with disbelief. "We haven't abandoned her," she insisted, adjusting her pearls at her collar as though dignity could be salvaged in the right posture. "We've done what parents must. We've endured uncomfortable chairs, cold air, overpriced coffee." She gestured toward the seat where she had perched for hours, as if the wrinkles in the cushion testified to her love. She leaned toward the guard, her lips tilting downward, speaking as though my husband had misled them all. "Surely you can't think we're harmful. We're her family." The guard did not flinch. His hands remained folded behind his back, waiting. My sister reacted with outrage only when she realized what it meant for her accounts. "Wait, no," she hissed, clutching her phone to her chest. "You can't kick me out. I have the followers invested now. People are waiting for updates." Her tone soared upward like a bubble about to pop. She turned on my husband, eyes wide, breath shallow in that way she performed on camera for sympathy. Except nothing was rolling now but her panic. "You can't do this. This is censorship. You're erasing me." She clung to phrases she often recited online when companies removed her posts, strings of words about freedom and expression. But no algorithm was behind this decision. It was legal weight and iron certainty. My husband stayed silent, his hand tightening around mine instead of wasting words on them. His side profile, clean lines of anger and authority, said enough. He didn't need speeches. The officers at either end of the hall stepped forward slowly. The shuffle of their shoes echoed under the fluorescent hum. My family's protests grew sharper as the distance between them and the bed shortened. My mother's voice cracked as she declared the situation unfair. My father kept repeating that paperwork could not override blood, though every inch of his body betrayed that he knew otherwise. My sister tried live streaming the removal, only to watch in horror as one of the guards gestured to cut it off, his presence alone enough to make her thumb freeze against the screen. The first touch came gently, a hand on my father's elbow, guiding. He stiffened, then let himself be led, his jaw set tight, muttering numbers under his breath as though recalculating balance sheets might undo what was happening. My mother followed, pressing her purse close to her body, eyes wide with a mix of insult and fear. She kept glancing backward at me, not with affection, but with disbelief that I wasn't rising to defend their presence. I couldn't speak, not through the mask and the swelling. But the truth rang clear in my silence. The nurses knew it. My husband knew it. The staff shifting out of the way for the escort knew it. I didn't want them there. My sister resisted the longest. She sank lower into her chair like a child refusing bedtime. "I can't lose this arc," she said, nearly whispering, clutching her phone so hard her knuckles whitened. This was mine. When the guard curved a hand under her arm, helping her up with practiced efficiency, her body went rigid. The phone slipped against her palm, screen flickering with unread notifications. She gasped as though that loss, the scroll without her words, was heavier than the departure itself. She yanked her arm free at the door to call backward. "You'll regret this when people ask why you shut me out." No one answered her. And then they were gone. The door closed behind them with a weight I hadn't realized the hinges carried. The air itself shifted, less dense, more breathable. For hours, it had felt like toxic perfume clouding every inch of my chest, filling space the oxygen should have occupied. Now the fragrance dissipated. I could hear the hum of machines without it competing against complaints. I could sense the calm in the nurses' voices, freed from the need to grit their teeth at selfish chatter. Even my own breath, shallow though it still came, flowed easier without their presence, pressing into each inhale. I let my eyes drift toward my husband. His expression softened the second the door latched, fury leaving his body like steam. He traced his thumb gently against the back of my hand, quiet in that way comfort often is when it doesn't demand attention. The relief on his face mirrored the relief in my lungs. The weight of their absence was the gift. In that new calm, the lesson landed. The drama they had spun in every corner of this room hadn't existed unless we allowed them to play their roles. They had thrived like performers, writing dialogue about costs, frustrations, sympathy posts. But with them gone, the stage fell silent, as if no one had ever scripted tragedy for attention. It became clear that survival wasn't only about body and blood. Survival meant cutting the cast that refused to honor the role. Sometimes the real twist doesn't arrive wrapped in sirens or machines flatlining. Sometimes it's quieter, heavier, disguised as legal paperwork sliding across a counter. The realization that the story only continues if you allow the wrong actors to keep stealing the dialogue. And as the air cleared in that ER bay, I understood it didn't matter if they claimed misunderstanding, or held receipts, or cried about inconvenience. Their exit was the pulse the room needed. Their absence made space for life itself to breathe. I survived the allergy, but the greater sickness in that room wasn't swelling in my throat. It was the way my family measured my life in bills, convenience, and social media metrics. The poison wasn't peanut oil. It was their priorities stacked against me. What should have been love revealed itself as obligation, brittle and transactional. In the end, what carried me wasn't shared blood, it was chosen loyalty. Some ties are contracts, others commitments. When crisis forces the reveal, the difference is clear. What's worth more, breath or balance sheets, followers or family? The answer isn't complicated unless you make it.